HOA built 26 cabins on my private island, thinking the project made them untouchable. I stayed silent, gathered proof, and revealed the deed in court that destroyed their entire resort dream. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. The strangest thing about watching someone build a resort on your property is realizing you are the only person in the room who knows they are already losing. My name is Everett Caldwell, and I learned that lesson the day I returned to my private island and found something that should have been impossible: a resort. 26 brand new cabins stood between the trees where my family had spent generations enjoying the quiet. Fresh wood, new walkways, a massive dock stretching into the water, and everywhere I looked, there were signs that someone had turned my private land into a business without asking me. I still remember the sound before I saw it: the sharp rhythm of construction tools cutting through the peaceful island air, the smell of fresh lumber mixing with the ocean breeze, the voices of workers moving around like they belonged there. For years, my island had been the one place where everything stayed the same. My grandfather bought it decades ago, and every generation after him protected it. It was never abandoned. It was never forgotten. It was simply private. But when my boat reached the shoreline that morning, I saw a completely different place. The old dock was gone. In its place was a modern pier with lights and railings. The path my family used to walk through the woods had been replaced by carefully designed trails leading toward rows of cabins. 26 of them, all standing on land that belonged to me. I stepped onto the dock slowly, trying to understand what I was seeing. A worker noticed me and immediately stopped. Another looked away. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. They knew something was wrong. A large sign near the entrance caught my attention. It displayed the name of the project: Caldwell Island Retreat. Below it was the logo of the nearby HOA community. That was when I understood. This was not some random mistake. This was planned. The HOA had spent months building a resort on my private island. Before I could process it, a woman in a tailored jacket walked toward me carrying a tablet. Meredith Caldwell's son, the HOA president. She smiled confidently, as if she was welcoming me to a celebration. "Everett, I was wondering when you would finally come see what we've created." I looked behind her at the cabins. "What exactly did you create?" Her smile grew wider. "A place that benefits everyone. A private retreat for the community." I stared at her. "On my island." She paused briefly. Then she answered with complete confidence. "The island has been in use for years. We believed development made sense." That sentence stayed with me. Not because it surprised me, because it revealed exactly how she thought. Meredith did not see an owner. She saw empty space. She did not see private property. She saw an opportunity. And that was her biggest mistake. Because there is a difference between land that is quiet and land that is available. There is a difference between a place nobody visits and a place nobody has the right to touch. I could have argued with her that day. I could have demanded they stop immediately. I could have called authorities and created a scene. But I didn't. I simply looked at the 26 cabins surrounding me and realized something important. The more they built, the more evidence they created. Meredith thought every cabin made her position stronger. She thought finishing the resort would make it impossible for anyone to challenge her. What she didn't know was that I had something much stronger than her construction plans. I had something that had been in my family records for decades. A document that would prove one simple truth. They could build 26 cabins. They could spend millions. But they could never build on land they never owned. The hardest part about keeping a secret is watching everyone else celebrate the thing you already know will fail. For weeks after I discovered the cabins on my island, I said nothing. I watched from a distance as Meredith Caldwell's son and the HOA continued building the resort they believed would change everything. They thought my silence meant weakness. They thought I was too surprised to react. But the truth was much simpler. I was waiting. When someone makes a mistake, you can interrupt them immediately, or you can let them reveal the full size of that mistake. Meredith chose to build 26 cabins. She chose to hire contractors, approve designs, and spend money that never should have been spent. Every decision created another piece of evidence. I started documenting everything. I photographed the construction from every angle, the location of each cabin, the new dock, the electrical work, the roads cut through the island. I recorded dates, conversations, and every sign that showed the HOA was treating my property like their own. I also began reviewing their public records. That was when I discovered how confident Meredith really was. The HOA had created a complete business plan around the island. They had projected rental income. They had planned private events. They had marketing materials ready before the first guest ever arrived. They weren't just building cabins. They were building an empire. But there was one thing missing from every document I found. My name. There was no agreement signed by me. No lease. No transfer of ownership. No permission. The more I looked, the clearer the picture became. Meredith had convinced everyone that control over the nearby community gave her influence over everything around it. She confused being responsible for a neighborhood with having authority over someone else's land. And nobody questioned it. That was the part that surprised me most. A project that large required dozens of people to make decisions. Contractors, investors, board members, legal advisors. At any point, someone could have asked one simple question. Do we actually own this island? But nobody asked, because Meredith had already created a story everyone wanted to believe. She told them the island wasn't used. She told them the development would benefit the community. She told them the resort would bring value. And when enough people hear the same story, they sometimes stop looking for the truth. But I knew the truth was sitting somewhere safe. Inside my family's records. The deed. The document that had protected the island long before Meredith ever knew it existed. I contacted Daniel Mercer, a property attorney who had helped me with family assets in the past. I sent him everything I had collected. Photos, construction records, HOA documents, development plans. A few days later, we sat across from each other in his office. He reviewed the information carefully before looking up at me. Everett, they built a significant amount of property here. I nodded. They did. He looked confused. Most people would have tried to stop them immediately. I looked down at the documents on the table. I needed them to show exactly what they were doing. Daniel understood. Because the problem wasn't just that they built cabins. The problem was that they built them while believing they had the right. And now they had created a complete record proving otherwise. He asked me one final question. Are you sure you want to take this to court? I looked out the window toward the ocean. The same ocean surrounding the island my family protected for generations. Yes, I said. Because they need to understand something. I paused. They didn't build on empty land. They built on mine. Daniel opened the file containing the deed. The same document Meredith never requested. The same document that would eventually decide everything. At that moment, I knew the 26 cabins were no longer just a construction project. They were evidence waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The most important evidence is not always the evidence you discover first. Sometimes it is the evidence that has been waiting quietly for decades, protected by the people who understood its value. In my case, that evidence was inside an old wooden cabinet in my family home. A single document that would eventually decide the fate of 26 cabins sitting on my island. Before I could use it, I needed to understand exactly how far Meredith Caldwell's son and the HOA had gone. Daniel and I continued reviewing every document connected to the project. The deeper we looked, the more obvious the pattern became. This was not a simple misunderstanding between neighbors. The HOA had created an entire development plan around a property they never owned. They had construction contracts. They had financial projections. They had promotional materials. They had everything needed to run a resort. Everything except the one thing that mattered. Permission. One afternoon, Daniel placed a stack of documents on his desk and pointed to the first page. Look at this. I leaned forward. It was a construction agreement between the HOA and the company that built the cabins. The location was listed as a private island development. But nowhere in the agreement was there a signature from me. No approval from the owner. No authorization. Nothing. They never verified ownership before starting construction, Daniel said. I looked at the document again. It was almost unbelievable. A company had committed to building 26 structures without confirming who had the legal right to authorize the work. But the mistake did not stop there. The HOA's own meeting records revealed even more. Meredith had presented the island project as if the outcome was already guaranteed. She told the board that the community needed additional recreational space and that the island was the perfect solution. She showed them drawings. She showed them expected revenue. She showed them future growth. But she never showed them the deed. That detail mattered, because every decision the HOA made was based on an assumption. And assumptions become dangerous when millions of dollars are involved. I spent hours reading through those records. One sentence caught my attention. The island has remained unused and should be considered an opportunity for community expansion. I stared at those words. Unused. That was the foundation of their entire argument. Meredith believed that because I wasn't constantly walking across the island, the property somehow became available. But she misunderstood something fundamental. Ownership does not disappear when someone is not present. A house does not become public because the owner travels. A piece of land does not become community property because someone wants to develop it. The island was quiet because my family protected it, not because nobody cared about it. A few days later, Daniel and I visited the property again. Standing among the completed cabins felt different this time. Before, they looked like an invasion. Now, they looked like evidence. Every cabin represented a decision. Every pathway represented a choice. Every dollar spent represented a record of how far the HOA had gone without permission. Daniel walked through the property taking notes. Everett, the longer they continued building, the stronger your case became. I looked at the rows of cabins stretching through the trees. That's exactly why I didn't stop them immediately. He nodded. Because he understood the strategy. I wasn't ignoring the problem. I was documenting it. Meredith believed that a finished resort would force me into a negotiation. She believed the investment would make her untouchable. But she never considered that the same investment could become the clearest proof of wrongdoing. The cabin she built to create power had become the evidence that would remove it. That night, I returned home and opened the final storage box from my grandfather's records. Inside was a folder with faded edges. The label was simple: Island Ownership. I opened it slowly, and there it was. The deed. The document that had protected my family's property for generations. The document Meredith never asked to see. I placed it on the table and realized something. The HOA had spent months building a resort. I had spent months building a case. And soon, we would find out which one mattered more. The moment I held the deed in my hands, I understood why my grandfather had protected those records so carefully. It was not just an old piece of paper. It was the one thing that separated ownership from assumption. The HOA had spent months creating a resort because they believed their plans were stronger than my rights. But they never realized their biggest mistake was not building the cabins. Their biggest mistake was building them without knowing who actually owned the ground beneath them. I carefully reviewed every page of the deed with Daniel. The document was clear. The island had belonged to my family for decades. The boundaries were recorded. The ownership history was documented. There were no agreements allowing the HOA to develop the property. No easement. No lease. No transfer. Nothing. Daniel placed the deed back on the table and looked at me. This changes everything. I nodded. It always did. The problem was that Meredith Caldwell's son never cared enough to look. She saw an island. She saw empty space. She saw an opportunity. But she never saw the one question that should have come before everything else. Who owns it? Over the next few days, Daniel helped me organize the evidence. We created a complete timeline of the HOA's actions. The first planning meeting, the construction approval, the contractor agreements, the financial commitments, the marketing plans. Every step showed the same pattern. The HOA moved forward as if ownership was a detail they could solve later. But ownership was never a detail. It was the foundation. Without it, everything they built was unstable. I returned to the island one more time before we moved forward legally. Standing among the 26 cabins, I noticed something I hadn't thought about before. Every cabin had a story. Not a story of success. A story of decisions. Someone approved the design. Someone signed the contracts. Someone ordered the materials. Someone paid the workers. Each action created a record. And every record pointed back to the same mistake. They were building on property they did not control. The strangest part was that the cabins looked impressive. If someone arrived without knowing the truth, they might have believed Meredith had created something remarkable. The buildings were clean. The pathways were carefully designed. The view of the ocean was beautiful. But appearances can be misleading. A beautiful structure can still be built on the wrong foundation. That was exactly what happened. A week later, Meredith contacted me. Her voice sounded different from the first day we met. The confidence was still there, but now there was pressure behind it. "We need to discuss a solution," she said. I knew what she meant. She did not want to discuss what happened. She wanted to discuss how to save what she built. When we met, she brought a proposal. The HOA wanted a partnership agreement. They wanted access rights. They wanted to continue operating the cabins. I looked at the document in front of me. After months of construction, after spending millions, after creating an entire resort, they were finally asking for permission. But permission after the fact did not erase what happened. "Meredith," I said, "you built 26 cabins first and asked questions later." She looked frustrated. "You have to understand the amount of investment involved." I looked directly at her. "That investment was your choice." The room became quiet. Because that was the truth she did not want to accept. The HOA was not facing a problem I created. They were facing the consequences of a decision they made. When I left that meeting, I knew the next step was unavoidable. The courtroom. Meredith believed the completed cabins gave her power. She believed the money spent would influence the outcome. But she forgot something. Courts do not decide ownership based on confidence. They decide based on evidence. And I was ready to bring the strongest evidence I had. The deed. The document that proved the island was never theirs to develop. The most difficult part of a legal battle is not proving you are right. It is waiting while someone else believes they have already won. For months, Meredith Caldwell's son looked at those 26 cabins and saw success. She saw a completed vision, a future business, and a project that she believed was too large for anyone to challenge. But she never understood that every decision she made was creating a record of what happened. And that record was about to be seen by a judge. Before filing the case, Daniel and I prepared everything carefully. We did not want emotion to lead the process. We wanted facts. The deed, the property surveys, the construction records, the HOA meeting notes, the contractor agreements. Every document had a purpose. When we organized everything together, the story became impossible to ignore. The HOA did not accidentally build on my island. They planned it. They approved it. They funded it. They promoted it. And at no point did they receive permission from the person who actually owned the property. The lawsuit was officially filed a few weeks later. When Meredith received the legal notice, she immediately contacted my attorney. She wanted a conversation. Not about ownership. Not about the missing permission. She wanted to talk about compromise. That was the moment I realized she still did not understand the situation. During the meeting, Meredith arrived with several documents of her own. She brought financial reports showing the amount of money invested into the cabins. She brought statements about how many residents supported the project. She brought information about the economic value the resort could create. Then she placed everything on the table. "Do you understand what is at stake?" she asked. I looked at the documents. "I do." She leaned forward. "This project represents millions of dollars." I nodded. "And it was built on land you didn't own." Her expression changed. Because that was the one fact none of her paperwork could overcome. Money could show investment. Plans could show ambition. Community support could show popularity. But none of those things could create ownership. Daniel explained the situation clearly. The court will not decide based on how much was spent. The court will decide whether they had the legal right to build. That was the difference between Meredith and me. She believed the size of the project gave her power. I believed the truth would speak for itself. As the court date approached, I returned to the island one final time before the hearing. The cabins looked different now. The same buildings that once represented Meredith's confidence now looked like reminders of a decision that went too far. The wooden walls were finished. The paths were complete. Everything looked ready. But nobody was arriving. Nobody was checking in. Nobody was using the resort. 26 cabins were waiting for a future that might never come. I walked through the property quietly, remembering what the island looked like before the construction began. The trees, the open space, the peaceful shoreline. That was what Meredith never understood. The island was already valuable before she built anything. It did not need a resort to have meaning. The value was never in the cabins. The value was in the land itself. The morning of the court hearing arrived with a strange sense of calm. Meredith walked into the courtroom surrounded by attorneys and documents. She looked confident again, just like the first day she greeted me on the dock. She believed the completed resort was her strongest argument. She believed the investment would matter. She believed the judge would see what she had built. But I knew something she didn't. The judge was not going to see a resort first. The judge was going to see ownership. And sitting inside my folder was the one document that had been waiting for this moment. The deed. The same document that protected my family's island for generations. The same document that Meredith ignored. The same document that would prove 26 cabins had been built on land that was never hers to control. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. After months of construction noise, arguments, and unanswered questions, everything came down to a room filled with documents and people waiting for the truth to be revealed. Across from me sat Meredith Caldwell's son, surrounded by attorneys and paperwork. She looked confident, but I could see something different in her expression. For the first time, she was no longer controlling the situation. The HOA attorney began by presenting their argument. They talked about the investment. They talked about the community benefits. They talked about how much effort had gone into creating the 26 cabins. They showed photographs of the finished resort. They showed financial records. They showed plans for future operations. To them, the cabins represented progress. But to me, they represented a question that had never been answered. Who gave them permission? When it was their turn, they focused on everything they had built, but they avoided the one thing that mattered most. Ownership. Daniel waited patiently until their presentation was finished. Then he stood. He did not raise his voice. He did not make dramatic accusations. He simply opened the folder in front of him. The first document he placed on the table was the property deed. The courtroom became silent. This document establishes the legal ownership of the island, Daniel said. He explained the history of the property. He showed the recorded boundaries. He showed the ownership records that had remained unchanged for decades. Then he asked the question that changed the entire direction of the case. Can the HOA provide any document showing they had permission to build on this property? The other side looked through their files. A few seconds passed. Then a minute. Nobody answered. Because there was no answer. They had construction contracts. They had financial agreements. They had development plans. But they did not have authorization from the owner. The judge reviewed the documents carefully. The same documents Meredith ignored before construction began were now the center of the entire case. The HOA attorney tried to explain that the project was created in good faith. They argued that everyone involved believed the development was allowed. But Daniel responded with a simple statement. Good intentions do not create property rights. That sentence stayed in the room. Because that was exactly what this case was about. Meredith believed the project was valuable enough to justify itself. She believed the community benefit mattered more than the missing permission. But the law did not work that way. A person cannot build on private land simply because they believe the result will be positive. The judge continued reviewing the evidence. The construction timeline. The HOA meeting records. The contractor agreements. The absence of any signed approval from me. Everything connected back to the same conclusion. The HOA made a decision about property they did not own. I watched Meredith as the reality started to reach her. The same confidence she carried when she first stepped onto my dock was gone. The 26 cabins that once represented her success were now the strongest evidence against her. After reviewing the records, the judge issued a temporary order preventing the HOA from operating or expanding the resort until ownership and authorization issues were fully resolved. The project that Meredith believed was too large to stop had stopped, not because someone destroyed it, not because someone fought louder, because the facts finally caught up. Outside the courtroom, Daniel looked at me and smiled. That deed did exactly what you expected. I looked down at the folder in my hand. The same document my grandfather had protected. The same document Meredith never thought she would see. I knew the truth would matter, I said. And it did. The HOA built 26 cabins hoping the finished resort would give them power. Instead, every cabin became a reminder of one simple mistake. They built something impressive. They built something expensive. But they built it on land that was never theirs. The most satisfying victories are not the ones where someone loses everything. They are the ones where the truth finally becomes impossible to ignore. After the court hearing, the 26 cabins on my island were no longer a symbol of Meredith Caldwell's success. They became a symbol of what happens when someone mistakes confidence for authority. But the legal battle was not finished yet. The temporary order stopped the HOA from operating the resort, but the final decision would determine what happened next. Meredith and her team still believed they had options. They continued arguing that the project was created with good intentions and that removing the cabins would create unnecessary problems. But every argument brought them back to the same issue. They never had permission. Over the following weeks, the court continued reviewing the evidence. The details became clearer with every document examined. The HOA board meeting records showed how the project was approved. The contractor agreements showed who built the cabins. The financial records showed how much money was invested. And the deed showed who actually owned the island. Every piece connected. Every road led back to the same conclusion. The HOA had created an entire resort based on an assumption. Not a contract. Not a legal agreement. An assumption. During the final hearing, Meredith appeared different from the woman I first met on the island. The confidence was still there, but it was mixed with frustration. She looked at the cabins as if she still believed they represented something valuable enough to change the outcome. Her attorney argued that the resort had already become a significant investment. They talked about the construction costs. They talked about the future income. They talked about the residents who supported the project. Then Daniel stood and responded. The value of the construction does not change the ownership of the land. That sentence summarized everything. Because the HOA kept focusing on what they created. But the court was focused on whether they had the right to create it. Those were two completely different questions. The judge reviewed the final documents carefully. Then came the decision. The court confirmed that the island was privately owned property. The HOA had no recorded rights allowing them to develop it. The construction project could not continue as planned. The resort operation was permanently stopped. I remember looking across the courtroom at Meredith. Months earlier, she had stood on my dock and proudly explained what she had built. She had looked at 26 cabins and seen a future. Now she was looking at the same cabins as the reason her entire plan had failed. After the hearing, Daniel and I walked outside. The air felt different. For months, every conversation had been about what the HOA built. Now, for the first time, the conversation was about what they never had the right to build. You know what the interesting part is? Daniel said. What? They thought finishing the cabins protected them. I looked toward the parking lot. But finishing them only created more evidence. He nodded. That was exactly what happened. Every completed cabin showed the scale of their decision. Every construction record showed their involvement. Every document showed they moved forward without the one thing they needed. Permission. When I returned to the island after the final ruling, I walked through the same paths that once made me feel like a stranger on my own property. The cabins were still there. The dock was still there. The buildings were still standing. But their meaning had changed. They were no longer someone else's dream. They were a lesson. A reminder that money cannot replace ownership. Planning cannot replace permission. And confidence cannot replace the truth. Meredith built 26 cabins believing she was creating something permanent. Instead, she created a permanent record of the mistake she made. The island was never theirs. The deed proved it. And now everyone knew it. The most surprising thing about losing a battle is realizing the moment you lost was actually the moment you thought you had won. For Meredith Caldwell's son, that moment came the day she looked at 26 finished cabins and believed they represented power. She saw a completed resort. She saw an investment too large to challenge. She saw the future she had created. But everyone else saw something different. They saw a project built on land that never belonged to her. After the court decision became public, the reaction inside the HOA community changed quickly. Residents who once supported Meredith began asking questions they should have asked months earlier. How was this approved? Who verified ownership? Why did nobody contact the actual property owner before construction started? Those questions were no longer private conversations. They became the reason trust in the HOA began to disappear. I watched from a distance as the same people who once celebrated the resort started reviewing the documents themselves. They looked through meeting records and financial reports. They saw the presentations Meredith gave and the promises she made. But they also noticed what was missing. My signature. My approval. My permission. The absence of those things was impossible to explain. The HOA had built a project around an idea that was never legally valid. Over the next few months, the future of the 26 cabins remained uncertain. The buildings were still standing, but they could not operate as Meredith planned. No guests arrived. No events were held. No business opened. The resort that was supposed to bring people together became a reminder of a mistake everyone could see. I returned to the island during that time. The first time I saw the cabins, I felt like someone had taken a piece of my family's history without asking. This time, I felt something different. I saw proof. Every cabin represented a choice. Every path represented a decision. Every structure showed how far the HOA was willing to go without checking the most basic fact: who had the right to build. I walked along the shoreline where my grandfather used to sit and watch the sunset. The sounds had changed after construction began, but now the island was becoming quiet again. The waves returned. The wind moved through the trees. The place started feeling like home again. That was something Meredith never understood. She believed the island needed to become something bigger. She believed the value came from what could be added. But my family knew the island already had value. The land itself was enough. The memories were enough. The history was enough. A few weeks later, I received a message from one of the HOA residents. It was not an apology exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. We should have asked questions before believing everything we were told. That sentence stayed with me. Because that was the real problem. Not just Meredith. Not just the cabins. Not just the construction. The problem was that too many people accepted a confident explanation without checking the facts behind it. Meredith was convincing because she sounded certain. But certainty does not create ownership. Confidence does not create permission. And a finished project does not change the truth. The 26 cabins were still there, but their meaning had completely changed. They were no longer a symbol of HOA success. They were a permanent reminder that ambition without boundaries can become a mistake. Daniel called me one evening to discuss the final steps. "Do you think they understand now?" he asked. I looked toward the ocean. "I think they understand the result." "And the lesson?" I thought about that for a moment. The lesson is that you cannot build something on a foundation that does not belong to you. Because that was the truth Meredith learned too late. She believed completing the cabins would make the HOA impossible to stop. Instead, completion made the mistake impossible to ignore. They built 26 cabins trying to prove they had control. But in the end, those same cabins proved they never did. The most important thing I learned from this entire experience was that patience can be more powerful than confrontation. When Meredith Caldwell's son first stepped onto my island and proudly showed me what she had built, she believed the story was already written. She believed the HOA had created something too large to challenge. But she forgot one important detail. The land had a history before her plans ever existed. And that history was protected by a single document: the deed. Years later, when I think about those 26 cabins, I do not remember them as a symbol of conflict. I remember them as a reminder of how easily people can mistake opportunity for ownership. Meredith saw an empty island. I saw my family's legacy. She saw a place where she could build something new. I saw a responsibility that had been passed down through generations. That difference was the reason everything changed. After the final ruling, the process of deciding what happened to the cabins began. The structures that were supposed to become a successful private retreat remained and used while the legal and restoration details were handled. The same buildings that once represented Meredith's biggest achievement became the biggest reminder of her mistake. The HOA had spent months creating a vision. They had spent money. They had created plans. They had convinced people that the future was already guaranteed. But they never secured the foundation that mattered most: the right to build. I eventually returned to the island after everything was settled. I walked along the shoreline early in the morning, listening to the waves instead of construction equipment. That sound meant something to me. For months, the island had been filled with unfamiliar noises. Machines, tools, workers, the sounds of someone else changing a place that was never theirs. Now, the island was quiet again. The trees moved with the wind. The water touched the shore. The place felt like itself. I stood near the cabins for a long time. They were still impressive structures. There was no denying the effort that went into building them. But effort alone does not create a right. Money does not create ownership. A finished project does not erase the need for permission. That was the lesson Meredith learned too late. A few months after the final decision, I received a message from one of the residents who had originally supported the HOA project. They wrote, "We trusted the plan because it sounded right. We should have asked if it was legal." That message stayed with me because it explained exactly how situations like this happen. People hear confidence. They see progress. They assume someone has already checked the details. But sometimes the person leading the project is the person who never asked the most important question: is this actually ours to change? Meredith had an answer before she had proof. That was her mistake. I had proof before I ever needed an answer. That was my advantage. Looking back, I do not feel like I defeated the HOA. I feel like the truth finally caught up with a decision that should never have been made. The island was never against development. It was never against improvement. It was simply against being taken without permission. And that distinction matters. Because anyone can build something. Anyone can spend money. Anyone can create a plan and convince others to follow it. But ownership cannot be created through confidence. It cannot be created through popularity. It cannot be created because enough people believe it should exist. Ownership comes from the truth written in the records. And in my case, that truth had been waiting quietly for decades. The HOA built 26 cabins believing they were creating their future. Instead, they created the strongest evidence of their mistake. The island remained mine. The deed proved it. And sometimes, the quietest document can speak louder than the biggest construction project in the world.